My name is Eleanor Hart and I'm 32 years old. 16 years ago, I sat in a hospital parking lot in my graduation gown, alone eating a vending machine sandwich, while 3 miles away my family cheered my name into an empty auditorium seat. I know it was empty because I have the photo. My mother sent it to me an hour later with one line underneath, "We saved you a seat." Shame you couldn't make it. I hadn't skipped my graduation. I'd been called into a double shift at Riverside Diner because our assistant manager quit that morning. And if I said no, we lost the account that paid our family's rent. Nobody else in my house had a job. My sister Josephine was 17, and my parents had decided quietly years before that Josephine didn't need one. Josephine had a bright future. Josephine was going to be somebody. I was going to be whoever kept the lights on. Welcome to Quiet Hearts Rewritten, where the ones who paid the bills finally get to tell their side. If stories about family, sacrifice, and finally being seen speak to you, drop a comment and subscribe. You'll want to be here for what happens at the end of this one. Let me take you back to the afternoon everything in my family got its final shape. The day my father sat me down at the kitchen table, 3 weeks before that graduation, and told me the plan. Josephine got into Ashcombe Academy, he said, sliding a glossy brochure across the table like a winning hand. Private, prestigious, 40 minutes from our house in Millbrook, Connecticut. Tuition's steep, Ellie. We need you to pick up more shifts. I was 17 too at the time he first said this, a year earlier, before I'd even graduated high school myself. I was already working weekends at Riverside. He wasn't asking. He was informing me the way you inform an employee of a schedule change. What about my classes? I asked. What about applying anywhere? My mother, without looking up from folding laundry, said the sentence that would define the next 11 years of my life. Josephine has the grades for college, sweetheart. You have the work ethic for now. We all play our part. I didn't argue. I never argued. I picked up the extra shifts. I deferred community college for 1 semester, then 2, then indefinitely. And on the morning of my own graduation, when the diner called, I already knew, with a certainty that curdled in my stomach, exactly which one of us my parents would choose if I asked to be excused. I didn't ask. I clocked in at noon. What I didn't know yet was that my mother had a second photo from that auditorium, one she never sent me, one I wouldn't see for another 15 years, and one that would prove every single thing I'd suspected about that empty seat was a lie. The diner shift that day was the longest 6 hours of my life. I remember untying my apron in the break room, still wearing my cap and gown underneath it, because there hadn't been time to change. A regular customer, Mr. Delacroix, an old widower who came in every Tuesday for pancakes, looked at me over his coffee and asked, "Why a girl in a graduation?" Gown was refilling his ketchup. "Working," I told him. He didn't ask anything else. He just left me a $50 tip and wrote, "Proud of you, whoever you are," on the napkin. I still have that napkin in a drawer in Portland, Oregon, where I live now. It's the first time anyone ever said those 3 words to me. Josephine's graduation, 4 years later, looked nothing like mine had never happened. My parents rented a hall. Not a restaurant, an actual banquet hall in downtown Millbrook, with a hired photographer and a 3-tier. Cake that said, "Our future doctor," in cursive icing. Even though Josephine hadn't been accepted to medical school yet, she'd only just finished her undergraduate degree in biology, a degree my overtime pay had quietly financed for 4 straight years as well. I told myself it was temporary. I was there for that one. Of course I was there. I was never allowed not to be there for Josephine's things. I stood in the back near the coat check in my one good dress, and I watched my father give a toast that lasted 11 minutes. He talked about Josephine's discipline, her sacrifice, her focus. He said the word sacrifice 3 times. I counted. I was the one who'd sacrificed to graduation, 4 years of full-time school, 2 relationships that couldn't survive my schedule, and every ounce of savings I'd built toward my own apartment. And I was standing in the back near the coats. Afterward, Josephine found me by the punch bowl. She'd had 2 glasses of champagne she wasn't legally old enough for, and her cheeks were flushed with the kind of warmth that makes people say true things they normally keep folded up. "You know," she said, swirling her glass, "Mom told me once that you never even wanted to go to college. That waitressing was just like your thing." I set my punch down very carefully. She said, "What?" "That you were happier this way, simpler, no pressure." Josephine shrugged, already looking past me towards someone else she wanted to talk to. "I always just figured that's why nobody made a big deal out of your graduation. There wasn't really anything to celebrate, right? You were already doing what you wanted." I stood there holding a plastic cup, 60 seconds away from understanding that my entire adult life had been narrated to my own sister in a version where I didn't exist as a person who'd lost anything at all. That was the night I started keeping a folder. I want to be fair here, the way I've promised myself to be fair in every part of this. My parents weren't cruel people in the cartoon sense. My father worked 22 years at the same auto parts warehouse without missing a shift. My mother clipped coupons and stretched chicken thighs into 4 different dinners. They weren't villains sitting in a lair somewhere, twirling mustaches. They were 2 tired people who had decided, quietly and probably without ever saying it aloud to each other, that one daughter was the plan and the other daughter was the funding for the plan. I was the funding. That night after Josephine's graduation, I went home to the 1-bedroom apartment I'd finally managed to afford at 26, and I opened a plain manila folder I'd bought at a drugstore. I didn't know yet what it was for. I just knew I was tired of being told, indirectly, secondhand, through my own sister, what my life had supposedly meant. I started with pay stubs, 11 years of them going back to that first double shift at 17, then bank transfers, the wire records, showing money I'd sent home for the household, which somehow always coincided with tuition due dates, SAT prep courses, a laptop for Josephine's sophomore year, a used Honda Civic for her 16th birthday that my father told the neighbors he'd saved up for. I hadn't saved up for anything in 11 years. I'd been the savings account. The folder grew. Every receipt, every transfer. Every year another manila envelope stuffed inside the first, until it was less a folder and more an archive, my own quiet, unglamorous evidence locker, built the way you build something you tell yourself you'll probably never use. Then, 3 years after that banquet hall graduation, my mother called me on a Tuesday evening while I was closing out the diner register and said the sentence that turned my archive from a habit into a plan. "Baltimore, it's very competitive, Ellie, but there's a gap, housing, moving costs." A few months before her stipend kicks in, we told her you'd help. You always do. I stood there with the register drawer still open, 20s fanned out under my fingers, and I heard myself say, "Of course," a word that came out of me before my brain had even voted on it. But that night, driving home, because for the first time in my life, a second voice had spoken up right behind the automatic one, quiet, and completely new to me. It said, "Not this time." And 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived at my apartment that would tell me exactly how to make that voice heard. The envelope had no return address, just a Millbrook postmark. Inside was a single folded sheet of stationery. I recognized instantly my grandmother's, the pale blue kind with her initials embossed at the top, the same paper she'd used to write, and me letters every month until she passed when I was 24. Except this letter wasn't old. The ink was fresh and the handwriting, though it tried to imitate my grandmother's looping style, was slightly off. It was my Aunt Ruth's writing. Ruth was my grandmother's youngest sister, the family's designated difficult one, the aunt nobody invited to holidays, because she stirred things up. I hadn't spoken to her in 6 years. The letter read, "Eleanor, before your grandmother died, She asked me to hold something for you, to give you when you were old enough to use it right. I think that time is now. Call me, Ruth. I called that night. Ruth answered on the second ring like she'd been waiting. What she told me over the phone took the folder I'd been building, the pay stubs, the transfers, the receipts, and turned it into something with teeth. My grandmother, it turned out, had left a trust. Not a large one, but not nothing, $60,000. Set aside specifically for whichever grandchild needs a fair start. Decided at my sister Ruth's discretion, since my son and his wife cannot be trusted to decide fairly. Ruth read me that line twice, slowly, so it would land. My grandmother had watched the same 11 years I had. She'd watched from her armchair every holiday, saying nothing. The way older women and families often say nothing until it's almost too late to matter. But she'd seen the shape of it, Josephine's laptops and cars and tuition, and me disappearing into double shifts nobody thanked me for. And she'd built a quiet correction into her will. One my parents didn't know existed because Ruth had been asked to keep it sealed until I asked for it myself. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked her, my voice cracking in a way I hadn't let it crack in years. She said, and this is word for word, Ellie. She spent years thinking she's the strong one. The day she stops being proud of that is the day she's ready. I sat on my kitchen floor with the phone, against my ear for a long time. After we hung up, $60,000 suddenly real in a bank account 3 towns over, and one single sharpening thought taking shape behind it. My parents were about to ask me again to hand over money for Josephine's Baltimore move, and for the first time in 11 years, I had something they didn't know about, and a plan for exactly how I was going to use it in front of all of them. I didn't touch Ruth's money right away. I let it sit quiet and untouched, the way you let a loaded question sit before you ask it out loud. Instead, I did something I'd never once done in 11 years. I said no to my mother plainly on the phone about Josephine's Baltimore move. I can't help with this one, I said. I'm tight this month. The silence on the line lasted 4 full seconds. Then my mother's voice went cool in a way. I recognized instantly the tone she used on cashiers, who wouldn't honor an expired coupon. Tight, she repeated. Eleanor, your sister is about to start her residency. Do you understand what that means for this family? I understand what 11 years of overtime has meant for this family, I said. I'd like to understand what it's meant for me. She hung up on me. Not dramatically, just a soft click. The sound of a woman who assumed the conversation would simply resume later on her terms, the way it always had. It didn't resume for 6 weeks. Then my father called instead, which told me everything about how seriously they were taking my refusal. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. He just said, your mother's upset. Josephine's stressed enough without this. Can't you just find a way? I've been finding a way since I was 17, Dad, I said. I'd like someone else to find one for a change. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that told me the family archive of my life was even more distorted than I'd realized. You always made it look easy, Ellie. You never said it was hard. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, staring at the manila folder sitting on my counter 11 years thick, and I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with grief. He believed it. He actually believed the version where I'd volunteered for all of it. Cheerfully, the way you volunteer to bring a side dish to a potluck. I have to go, Dad, I said, and I hung up first for the first time in my life. 3 days later, an invitation arrived at my apartment, cream cardstock, gold foil lettering. Josephine was hosting a bon voyage to Baltimore dinner at my parents' house. Family only, to celebrate her residency before the move. My mother had written a note at the bottom in her looping hand. We'd love for you to be there. Ellie, it wouldn't feel right without you. I read that line 4 times. It wouldn't feel right without me. The same woman who told my sister I never wanted college in the first place, who'd erased my empty auditorium seat into a story about a girl who was simply, happily uncomplicated. IRSVPD, yes. And I called Ruth that same afternoon, because I finally knew exactly what I was bringing to that dinner besides a bottle of wine, and exactly which folder was coming with me. Ruth met me for coffee 2 days before the dinner, and she brought something I hadn't asked for and didn't know existed. A shoebox of her own, filled with photographs my grandmother had kept separately from the family albums. Ruth called it the other archive. There were pictures of me at 14, apron already on, sweeping the floor of a diner I shouldn't have been working in yet. Technically too young for the job, but the owner had liked my mother and looked the other way. There was a photo of Josephine at the same age, asleep on a couch with a tutor's worksheet still in her lap, a tutor my overtime had paid for without my knowledge, arranged directly between my parents and the tutoring center, so I never see the invoice. And there was one more thing. A single Polaroid taken from the back of an auditorium, time-stamped the year of my graduation, not the empty seat my mother had photographed and sent me. A different photo taken 30 minutes earlier, showing my father standing near the exit doors, phone in hand, clearly mid-argument with my mother, his face tight with something that looked unmistakably like guilt. "Your grandmother took that," Ruth said. "She was there. She saw your dad try to leave and go get you from the diner himself. Your mother stopped him at the door. Said if he left, it would look like the family was falling apart in front of everyone." I stared at that photograph for a long time. 15 years I believe nobody in that auditorium had thought of me at all. And the whole time there'd been one small, unresolved argument happening at the exit doors. One parent who'd almost come to get me, stopped by the other for the sake of appearances. It didn't undo anything, but it complicated the villain in a way I hadn't expected and hadn't asked for. 2 days before I was supposed to sit across a dinner table from both of them. "What are you going to do with all this?" Ruth asked, nodding at the folder now sitting beside her shoebox. "I'm going to tell the truth out loud," I said. Once, at a table where everyone's finally in the same room, Ruth studied me the way my grandmother used to, like she was checking a pie crust for the right color. "Your grandmother left you something else, you know? Not money. A letter sealed for the day you finally did this. She said you'd know exactly when." She slid a second envelope across the table. My name written in that same looping, embossed hand I hadn't seen new in 8 years. I didn't open it there. I put it in my bag next to the folder, next to Ruth's Polaroid, and I drove home already rehearsing in the dark of my car. The first sentence I had planned to say at that dinner table, the one. I'd waited 11 years to finally have the floor to speak. The dinner was exactly what I expected. My mother's good china, a centerpiece of white roses, Josephine glowing at the head of the table, like she'd already been sworn in as chief of medicine. My father sat where he always sat, quiet, refilling water glasses instead of speaking, the same instrument he'd always played. I brought the folder in a plain tote bag and set it by my feet, under the table, and I said nothing for the first 40 minutes. I let them have their toast. My mother stood, glass raised, and gave a speech about Josephine's unshakable focus and the sacrifices this family made together to get her here. Together, that word again. To the whole family, my mother said, looking around the table for believing in her. I raised my glass with everyone else. Then, into the small silence after the clinking stopped, I set my glass down and reached under the table. "Before we eat," I said, "I have something too." My mother's smile flickered the way it does when a script goes off its rails. "Ellie, this is Josephine's night." "It'll take 5 minutes," I said. And I placed the folder on the table between the roses and the gravy boat. This is 11 years of pay stubs. Every double shift I picked up since I was 17. Every wire transfer I sent home. And what it paid for, Josephine's tuition, her laptop, her car, her SAT tutor, her med school application fees. It's all here dated itemized. Nobody moved. Josephine's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "I also have this," I said. And I placed the Polaroid on top of the folder, my father at the exit doors. Mid-argument, the year of my graduation. Dad tried to come get me. I never knew that until 3 days ago. "I want you to know I found out." And I want you to know it mattered to me that you tried. My father's eyes went glassy. He didn't speak. He never did. And I want you to know, I said, turning to my mother, whose face had gone the color of the tablecloth, that I know exactly what you told Josephine about why I wasn't there, that I never wanted college, that waitressing was my thing, that there was nothing to celebrate. Josephine set her fork down slowly, looking between her mother and me like the floor had, just tilted under the good china. Mom, she said quietly, is that true? My mother opened her mouth, and for the first time in my entire life, no automatic answer came out of it at all, nothing rehearsed. Nothing smooth, nothing that sounded like church. And into that silence, I reached into my bag one more time, for the sealed envelope Ruth had given me, the one my grandmother had written for exactly this moment. And I said, there's one more thing you all need to hear. My grandmother wrote it herself, and she asked me to read it out loud, at a table when I was finally ready. I broke the seal. I unfolded my grandmother's letter with the whole table watching, and I read it exactly as she'd written it in her looping hand, no longer imitated by Ruth but real, 10 years old, waiting for this exact evening. Eleanor, if you're reading this at a table with your family around you, then you finally stopped being proud of carrying more than your share. And I said nothing because I was a coward in my own way too. I'm sorry for that. The trust is yours, no conditions. No discretion needed from Ruth once you've claimed it out loud like this. Use it for yourself, not the household. Not your sister, yourself. You were never the simple one. Ellie, you were just the one who paid for everyone else's complicated life. It's time you gotta have one of your own. I set the letter down. My mother was crying now. The real kind, not the church kind. Her hand pressed flat against her mouth. My father reached over and covered my hand with a shaking one and said, so quietly only I heard it, she always saw you clearest. I should have said something sooner. Josephine pushed back from the table and knelt beside my chair, tears cutting through her makeup. I didn't know, she said. I swear to you, Ellie, I didn't know any of this. I believe you, I said. That's exactly why I needed you to hear it tonight. From me instead of from her, like from me, instead of from me, instead of from her. One more time. I didn't ask for repayment. I didn't need to perform forgiveness I didn't feel yet either. I told them plainly, that I loved them and that I was done being the family's invisible infrastructure, that from now on, help would be a choice I made freely, not a debt collected quietly for 11 years. 6 months later, I used my grandmother's trust to finally enroll in the business program I'd deferred at 18, evenings and weekends, alongside a part-time job I chose instead of one assigned to me. I moved to Portland the year I finished, opened a small bookkeeping practice for local restaurant owners, people. I always tell my clients, who understand exactly what an unthinked double shift costs. My father visits every spring now alone, and we talk the way we should have talked years ago. My mother and I are still finding our way back, slowly, one honest phone call at a time. Josephine calls every Sunday, and last month she paid off my grandmother's original hospital bill from her first year of illness, without being asked, because she said she finally understood what together was supposed to mean. The manila folder sits in a drawer in my new apartment, next to Mr. Delacroix's napkin. I don't need either one to prove anything anymore. I keep them simply because some evidence, once it's finally spoken aloud, becomes something gentler. A record not of what I lost, but of exactly how I found my way back to myself.